Greetings and welcome to the 2011 treatment update. I'm Heidi Noss and I'm here with Cal Cohen and Kate Squires. Do you two want to just quickly introduce yourselves and say where you're from?
Sure. I'm Cal Cohen. I'm a clinician and a researcher in Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Kathleen Squires. I'm an infectious disease physician and a clinical researcher at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia.
Thank you. And Cal, thanks for hosting us here in Boston.
Sure,
for
happy
CROI.
to have you all.
Yeah, well, we're happy to be here. So I wanted to just, if I could quickly, get a sense from you two as clinicians and researchers, what your sense is of CROI 2011. I feel like, I've been to a few CROIs, and I feel like they each have sort of a feel. Sometimes there's a lot of big news and it's very exciting. Other times it's more incremental. Sometimes it can be a little depressing. It varies. What's your sense, Cal?
Well, if there's a theme of this meeting so far, it's been a massive focus on prevention, if only because we've recently seen the results of two big trials and the IPREX happening in just a few months ago. So we haven't had a meeting to discuss it, and a lot of our plenaries have been focusing on the topic of prevention. And that also reflects, I think, the fact that the treatment arena is a little bit more mature, and so we don't expect kind of explosions of data. We would expect more incremental. So that would be my sense, is that we're focusing on other parts of the epidemic that need our attention.
Yeah, I guess I would concur. There wasn't really any big, hot, new news, really, but more of a discussion of the new stuff on prevention, and specifically the IPREX data, because it really hasn't been presented officially at a conference. So there was a nice presentation by Bob Grant, and then a slew of presentations after that, honing in on that data. But I think there is an evolving theme about where do we go in terms of putting our resources? Is it behind treatment of infected patients? Or is it really trying to target prevention as a way of decreasing new infections? And do you do it that way, or do you just treat everybody, make the diagnosis, treat everybody, and that will decrease infection? And so I think there's been a lot of discussion around that theme during this conference.
Do you have any feelings about that particular question?
Well, I think it depends on the background that you come from. I'm a clinician who's been dealing with HIV-infected patients since the beginning of the epidemic. And so certainly treatment is for somebody who's already infected is something that needs to be accomplished. I think in terms of prevention, what I'm seeing with my newly diagnosed patients is mostly young men. And I'm talking young. I have a 19-year-old, and I'm feeling like I'm a mother to a lot more 19 to 25-year-olds right now. And these are young men who sometimes are not making the most considered decisions, and so I'm a bit worried about thinking about prevention in HIV-negative people who might be in the throes of seroconversion, and thinking about resistance issues. And I'm also thinking about cost. We already are at a point in time where we don't have enough resources to treat the people who are already infected. And now we're thinking, if we have stable budget lines, we're thinking about maybe taking money out of that camp and putting it into prevention. So I'm very conflicted.
I guess that my response to that is we are grappling with this, and I think just as it is of concern that the men who come in with new infections may not be the best candidates to take PrEP because of their choices that they make, would they be the best candidates to even take treatment on a daily basis, or the people they're with to take treatment? And so there isn't going to be one simple answer. If there were, this would be a much shorter segment. It is complicated. We are grappling with the tools that we have and how to apply them. And I think it's going to be a question of really proportion of all of these, since all of these will work well for some populations and will really not work well for others. So I think that's where we're going to have to figure it out. As for the finances, I think what we're all struggling with right now is a sense of frustration that treatment dollars are limited. My personal sense of it is that because the prevention dollars won't come out of the HIV positive line items, because these people, after all, are negative, that we're probably putting those two at odds financially, one against the other, more than the external reality does, because the HIV negative treatment prevention dollars, if there are any, will come out of a completely different budget item. It'll come out of how we take care of HIV negative people who get a lot of other medical care, but it won't be out of the ADAP budgets that are really where we're feeling the most pinch. So in a global way, I think that the field is struggling with it, but I'm not sure that the payers yet would put it in the same line item. But thankfully, at least I went to a meeting in which the CDC did reassure us that the payers are on the list of people who are in the audience for discussions of how do we pay for prevention, given that we have some tools now.
And you two, just in our few minutes, have raised some really critical issues that in a way go way beyond the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections. I mean, it's not just whether we fund treatment or prevention, or is it more efficient actually to fund both? And we haven't even talked about treatment as prevention. Cal, you mentioned pre-exposure prophylaxis prep, which I think will be addressed in another session. But it raises larger questions about our values as a culture and as a society and really as a global economy. And I mean, way beyond the bounds of CROI, but all really important issues. And now it's interesting to see the science colliding with economies and economics and politics.
Yeah, I think in this situation, the science was a little bit out in front of the economics and the ethics and so forth. And now we're not playing catch up. I mean, everybody had thought through these issues, but I think we're a little bit, not caught by surprise, and nicely so that we do see efficacy. And where do we go with all of that?
Sure.
I think the other thing that is not of concern, but of interest to me, and I have an interest in HIV infection in women, is when the CDC guidelines come out for PrEP, it's going to be in a specific group, and that is MSMs. And
men who have sex with men.
Men who have sex with men.
Sure.
So the issue there is, are people just going to take those recommendations and kind of spread it around? And I think there are potentially some problems there because we don't have data in other groups of patients yet.
But in a way, that's not unlike what's happened historically in treatment, where we've extrapolated data from men into women, and we've extrapolated data from this group into that group. Yeah, it's an unfolding, really interesting field. So if I bring you both back to the treatment sessions at this conference, and you reflect on them, what would be, are there, let's say, 3 things that you took great interest in or think are highly relevant as you knew clinical practice or maybe even in your research?
Well, I'll start with one of them.
All right.
You
don't have to pick 3.
Well, that's okay. I'm sure we can each get to 3.
Okay,
but
good.
Probably the biggest, I think, study in terms of this conference was the presentation of the once daily raltegravir versus twice daily raltegravir. In that, it's one of the top 4 regimens. And
raltegravir is integrase?
Raltegravir is Icentrus, the integrase inhibitor by Merck. And so it is one of the top 4 preferred regimens by by many sets of guidelines, including the 2 in the U.S. And so many of us would prefer once a day if it's possible, and there were enough reasons to study the drug once a day given some of the background of the drug. But disappointingly, when given once a day, there was a higher failure rate. The failure rate is worse. It isn't terrible, but it is worse. And in fact, from a statistical point of view, we can even use the word inferior. And it's disappointing. And it was even disappointing to see that even patients with virologic suppression on, let's say, twice a day would still increase their risk of failure by a little bit if they went to once-a-day raltegravir. So at least from a day-to-day clinician point of view, that study I think will be an important one because many of us, certainly myself, were looking forward to a raltegravir once a day based on everything that led up to this study. And I think we now have to revisit what is the role of raltegravir given that it must be a twice-a-day drug.
And so that's particularly for your people walking through your clinic door who have never been on treatment before. Ideally, you'd love to give them a once-a-day regimen. I know myself and other people living with HIV love our once-a-day regimens.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's a concern.
Well, let's put it this way. There are certainly people in whom twice-daily raltegravir will still be a great choice because raltegravir, as was demonstrated in the study, is magnificently free of a lot of toxicities that make the drug an important one. So there will be a tension between I want once a day versus I like what raltegravir offers. Nevertheless, at least we understand the drug, and I think that this conference helped in a couple of other studies that I can think of to understand the limits of our therapy and the rules of the game, since every time we stretch, sometimes we get lucky, but sometimes we're disappointed. And this is one of those studies in which we have to realize there are rules to this drug.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it did bring home to us, even though we are at a point in time where we have many different regimens, and those of us who've been in the field for a long time think, we understand these drugs, and people have taken leaps of faith. I think it brings us back to understand, wait a minute, you really do have to do clinical trials to make sure that you're not putting people at risk. What's interesting is that the patients who were randomized to the once a day arm still had, by even 5 to 6 years ago, what we define as a terrific response, 80 to 85%. And now we're saying, wow, that's not good enough because,
right?
because the other arm, it's almost 89%. So I think it brought home that we still have to have the science drive us. So in terms of things that struck me in the treatment realm, and again, going back to the theme that I'm very interested in my male patients also, but in terms of thinking about how to target therapies, or are they different in terms of side effects and so forth between men and women, as many of these studies have a larger component of women, and now I'm thinking about the PEARLS trial, which was a trial that was done by the ACTG, and it was performed primarily outside of this country, but almost 2/3 of the patients in that trial were women. Treatment naive population, and really comparing by the end, there were 3 arms originally, 1 arm dropped out, so I'll talk about the 2 arms that they reported on, which was an efavirenz and combination of AZT and 3TC, or efavirenz and tenofovir and emtricitabine arm. And what they were able to show is that the efficacy did not differ by gender or by sex, but in terms of side effect profiles, there was clearly a difference for women. More side effects, more toxicity for women who received AZT and 3TC as opposed to tenofovir and FTC, and definitely in comparison to men, and it affected the overall outcome of the study. So as we really have a larger component of the people who are most at risk, and in this case women, we are seeing that there are some differences, and again, the take-home message is not one size fits all.
Yeah.
And we have to pursue that.
So one of the regimens you mentioned, I think some people might commonly know as a combination called a triplet, so Sostiva and Truvada. I think a lot of people know them by those names.
Right.
But the other arm involves AZT, which we don't really use much of anymore in the United States, certainly not in first, second line. But that raises another question about just the disparities in treatment globally and how different kinds of information is really relevant in different parts of the world. That our epidemic is becoming more and more complicated. Our treatment paradigms are becoming more and more complicated as well. But if we learn that about a combination like AZT and 3TC, it does hit home the point that I think you're making, that it's possible we'll learn about other differences by studying more women with every drug in every trial.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
So, one other point that I think it may be worth raising here is that while things are getting more complicated, I think one study that we just saw by Marty Markowitz also confirmed that in fact 3 drugs is the right number. He's done yet another study in which they went 5 versus 3.
In particular scenario, right?
In a particular, well, again, in a treatment-naive setting of people early
Very
on in
early,
infection,
right, yeah.
And with the assumption that would predict what would happen if you treated people even later on, showing that 5 wasn't better than 3. And so, which 3, of course, is the right 3 for that person is obviously our challenge, and we have some great ideas of the best 3. But we also can be once again reassured that 3 is the right number, that we're not under-treating people if only we added a 4th or a 5th. So I thought that was a reassuring study for us.
Yeah, so another, I think, interesting development in terms of treatment is the intersection between antiretroviral therapy and, in this case, treatment for one of our major complications, and that's hepatitis C. And it was really exciting to see for the first time the use of some of the new agents, the specific antiviral agents for hepatitis C in HIV-infected patients, and specifically in HIV-infected patients who are receiving antiretroviral therapy, and showing that you can co-administer the drugs. In this particular trial, the drugs that were being used were either an atazanavir, boosted atazanavir, or Rayataz regimen, or an efavirenz or Sostiva regimen with 2 nukes. And then one of the novel anti-HCV agents, telaprevir, plus interferon, plus ribavirin. And the response rates, now it's small numbers of patients, kind of proof of concept, but the response rates were just much better, dramatically better in patients who were randomized to the telaprevir arm. But more than that, the fact is that you can co-administer these drugs, and the reason I'm bringing that point home is that these anti-now HCV agents are metabolized through CYP3A4 or P450 enzymes, which is what our protease inhibitors and efavirenz are metabolized through. And so, great news that we can co-administer these agents.
So you looked a little bit at the HCV information too, Cal?
A little bit. This was one of the main studies in terms of treatment, and so we have 2 protease inhibitors that FDA is going to review sometime in 2011. I think most of us anticipate the data are strong enough that we will finally have 2 new drugs approved, and it's obviously tremendous news for people who are co-infected to make great progress.
Does it ever feel like a flashback to you as clinicians who've been in the field a long time, that HCV is kind of where HIV was, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe? Something like that?
It's basically the birth, if you will, of 3-drug therapy. Yeah, it's absolutely that 1998, wow, here it is.
Yeah.
Well, I think the great news is that we can learn from the lessons that we've had with HIV and perhaps be able to accelerate the HCV field. The other interesting thing about that is that even though hepatitis C is clearly a virus and an infectious disease, hepatitis, viral hepatitis, has really been managed for the most part by hepatologists who are internists but don't have infectious disease training. And now with the advent of these antivirals or medications that clearly work against the virus, we can have this collaboration between hepatologists and ID physicians to really try and move the field forward rapidly.
So do you have a sense of how this will affect how people with co-infection, HCV and HIV, will be treated? I mean, could you imagine a day, let's say, where protease inhibitors are, routine for you guys? Would you ever be managing this, or would you think it's always going to be this collaboration with some of the GI people and hepatologists and people like that?
I think it's going to be a collaboration.
Yeah.
I think for hepatologists, they have been managing mono-infected patients, but they've always been a little reticent about taking care of co-infected patients because they're worried about what to do about the other agents and so forth. So I think this is really prime time for collaborations between these 2 groups, and we can learn from each other.
So maybe we can bring them along
Yes.
in terms of their ability to manage both infections too. Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know. Did you guys have any interest in the prodrug, the tenofovir prodrug?
I think that just by raising that, I think it was perhaps maybe the third of the 3 that we can end on, which is that there is in fact a pipeline of new HIV medicines. Our field's, I think, been a little worried that industry's lost interest or that they really weren't finding anything. The prodrug of tenofovir, an attachment inhibitor by Bristol Myers. We've seen a little bit of evidence that it may in fact be another wave. We saw this morning some data from a study called Viking of an integrase inhibitor that might rescue some people with integrase resistance to the current drugs. So I think it's an exciting time to see that there is some progress being made for the hopefully small number of people who need yet another round because the current drugs are good, but obviously not perfect. So it was a little bit of reassurance on that one too.
You too, Kate?
Yeah, I was one of the investigators on the particular study, and there certainly are attributes of the prodrug which are very interesting, and you could think about various clinical situations in which you might use that. So yes, I think the fact that we have new drugs and we have new targets that we are developing drugs for is very good news for the field.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think for me as someone who takes some of these anti-HIV agents, I didn't walk away from this meeting thinking, there's a drug I want to switch to, or, there's some I want to keep my eye on. But this prodrug study, for example, is a big reminder too, I think, to me and to other people in the community that for this to really work, this long-time treatment, if we really want to treat people earlier, and that means keeping them on treatment longer, our drugs really do have to get better. They have to keep getting better and simpler, cleaner, easier, all of that. So this kind of investigation is really very critically important.
Right.
Yep, we agree.
We agree.
We agree.
Perfect.
Great.
I want to thank you guys so much for joining us, Cal Cohen and Kate Squires. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.